breaking news out of West Africa, where shadow operatives attempted to muzzle a rising voice. They tried to extinguish the revolutionary fire currently sweeping through Burkina Faso, but they have failed miserably. Captain Ibrahim Traore has emerged not just as a survivor, but as the living embodiment of national sovereignty and defiance. He remains unshakable, projecting a calm yet steel-eyed resolve, standing tall against the immense geopolitical pressures mounting against his administration. In the volatile wake of this brazen attempt to overthrow the government, President Traore refused to hunker down or play the victim, rejecting any notion of waiting idly for the next strike to fall. Instead, he launched a lightning-fast counter-strategy, implementing aggressive protocols designed to secure the continuity of the Burkinabe state and ensure his own survival against hostile actors. As the dust settles, we are seeing two monumental shifts in policy that are fundamentally rewriting the security architecture of the entire nation. The first pillar of this new strategy involves a massive nationwide overhaul of the internal security apparatus. Intelligence grids have been tightened, defensive fortifications are being bolstered around key infrastructure, and the military's readiness posture has been elevated to maximum alert levels across the board. However, it is the second strategic maneuver that is sending shockwaves far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, signaling a major geopolitical realignment. Traore has pivoted hard toward Moscow, aligning with a Russian state, defined by its combat history and defiance of Western hegemony, seeking a counterweight to the shadowy operatives suspected of orchestrating the coup. This brings up a massive question. What specifically does the Kremlin bring to this high-stakes table that the West could not? When you are locked in a death struggle against entrenched neo-colonial interests, this alliance could very well be the game-changing pivot point that ensures survival. To fully grasp the magnitude of this shift, we have to peel back the layers and examine the strategic chess match playing out behind closed doors since that plot was busted. Burkina Faso has been on a war footing ever since. The administration in Ouagadougou has been working 24/7 with a singular laser-like focus on insulating the presidency and stabilizing the erratic heartbeat of the nation. But the headline-grabbing development occurred when Russian President Vladimir Putin reportedly stepped in with an offer of direct assistance immediately following reports of a fresh destabilization attempt. Now, for those of us tracking the politics of the Sahel region, this pivot comes as absolutely zero surprise. Ouagadougou and Moscow have been methodically constructing a diplomatic fortress built on shared ideologies of sovereignty, strict independence, and a mutual disdain for external interference. Back in 2023, Traore made it crystal clear to the world, stating unequivocally that Russia had become a far more reliable ally than their former colonial masters in France. That declaration didn't just ruffle feathers, it sent seismic tremors through the traditional halls of power in Europe and the West. While the French legacy in the Sahel is tainted by accusations of strategic selfishness, the Russian approach is being marketed as pragmatic, respectful of local autonomy, and strictly transactional in a mutually beneficial way. However, to get the full picture, we need to look past the breaking headlines and understand the deep-seated roots of this conflict. You simply cannot comprehend Traore's aggressive posture without confronting the harsh historical reality of French dominance over Burkina Faso. For decades, Paris positioned itself as the indispensable security guarantor, claiming to be the shield against terrorism while supposedly professionalizing the local armed forces. Yet under previous civilian administrations, specifically during the long reign of Blaise Compaoré, this so-called security partnership didn't build a fortress. It dismantled the nation's defenses from the inside out. Rather than emboldening the military, the era of prolonged French oversight coincided directly with a catastrophic decline in combat capabilities. Violence spiraled out of control, militant factions seized more territory, and the military became a toothless tiger, unable to protect its own citizens. Despite the lofty rhetoric we hear from President Emmanuel Macron claiming France built up Sahelian armies, the facts on the ground paint a much grimmer, darker picture. Captain Traore, utilizing his first-hand experience on the front lines, has blown the whistle on what many suspected. The cooperation was a Trojan horse designed to hollow out Burkina Faso's military capacity. The roots of this dysfunction go all the way back to the colonial exit strategies and the post-independence accords that were effectively designed to strip the newborn state of its military autonomy before it could even stand on its own 2 feet. Under the guise of technical assistance, French officers took command of training doctrines and strategic planning, holding the keys to the kingdom. On the diplomatic documents, it looked like benevolence. But in reality, it was a systematic assault on sovereignty where foreign oversight ensured the Burkinabe army atrophied rather than evolved. Troops were sent into battle with gear that belonged in a museum, and in some humiliating instances, the state was forced to beg neighboring nations for borrowed weapons. It is an almost unthinkable reality for a nation that calls itself sovereign to be that helpless. This leads us to uncomfortable questions. If these foreign advisors were truly there to help, why was the military left to rot without modernization? Why was the government never pushed to acquire the modern firepower necessary to actually defend its population? The answer is disturbing but clear. These advisors weren't just incompetent, they were complicit. They actively gatekept the nation's armory, dictating what weapons could be bought, blocking sources of supply, and micromanaging how the military was allowed to deploy. For decades, leadership in Ouagadougou bowed their heads and complied, accepting this subservience without a fight, acting as if the nation had no inherent right to self-defense. This was beyond bad governance. It was a profound national humiliation. But the tragedy didn't stop at the leadership level. The rank-and-file soldiers on the ground endured dehumanizing conditions, often deployed without adequate rations, modern kits, or even basic shelter from the elements. Their paychecks were insultingly low, barely enough to keep body and soul together, let alone support a family, completely destroying morale in the barracks. When Captain Ibrahim Traore ascended to the presidency, he didn't just step into a political office. He inherited a military apparatus that had been systematically hollowed out from the inside. The armed forces were a shell of their former selves, suffering from a complete depletion of morale, stripped of their professional dignity, and driven to the absolute brink of psychological and tactical collapse. Facing a security crisis of this magnitude, one has to ask the hard question: how could a defense force in such a fractured state realistically be expected to protect the borders and the people of a sovereign nation? For years, we saw a recurring pattern where select groups of soldiers were rotated out and shipped off to France under the guise of receiving elite advanced combat instruction. To the casual observer, this looked like a benevolent partnership aimed at bolstering Burkina Faso's defense capabilities. But peel back the layers, and you find a reality that was far more insidious. These troops were not merely being educated in warfare, they were being subjected to a rigorous process of psychological conditioning and ideological reshaping. Instead of coming home with a renewed steel in their spine to defend their own flag, many returned with their worldviews fundamentally altered, effectively acting as proxies aligned with the strategic interests of Paris rather than Ouagadougou. It was a silent coup of the mind where their primary allegiance had been subtly yet effectively redirected toward a foreign power. If you conduct a forensic analysis of the key players behind the recent waves of instability rocking Burkina Faso, an undeniable and disturbing correlation begins to surface. A vast majority of them are alumni of these French military academies. We have to be clear that this was not a series of unfortunate coincidences. It was a calculated long-game strategy engineered to keep Burkina Faso in a geopolitical chokehold, ensuring the state remained fractured, dependent, and susceptible to outside manipulation. The endgame of this foreign policy was transparent to anyone paying attention. The goal was to systematically cripple Burkina Faso's ability to stand on its own 2 feet by compromising its military chain of command, eroding its national sovereignty, and trapping the populace in a perpetual cycle of fear and reliance. Throughout those long years of orchestrated chaos and manufactured fragility, the human toll on the ground was nothing short of catastrophic. We are talking about thousands of innocent lives extinguished, men, women, and children who became collateral damage in a high-stakes game of international chess and political sabotage. Upon taking the reins of power, President Traore immediately recognized the sheer scale of this duplicity and understood that the rot went deep into the institutional framework. He demonstrated zero hesitation in addressing the root cause of the rot. In one of his most defining and consequential executive decisions, he moved to completely dismantle the colonial-era defense pacts and issued a direct order for the immediate expulsion of French military contingents. This was a watershed moment, a bold declaration of independence that signaled the first genuine step toward reclaiming national destiny as Traore pivoted away from Western hegemony to seek alliances free from hidden traps. That strategic pivot directed his gaze toward the Kremlin, leading to a partnership with Russia, a global power often ostracized by the West, but one that signaled a readiness to stand shoulder to shoulder with Burkina Faso during its most critical hour of need. Now, Western critics are quick to push the narrative that Moscow is simply looking to fill the power vacuum left by France in the Sahel. But does that theory actually hold water when you look at the facts? Or are we witnessing an alliance forged in the fires of necessity, cemented by a mutual desire to push back against the overreach of external control? There is one historical fact that cannot be debated. Unlike the Western powers, Russia carries no baggage of colonial occupation in Burkina Faso, nor anywhere else on the African continent. That singular distinction fundamentally rewrites the diplomatic script as Russia engages without the lingering paternalistic imperial mindset that seems to still dictate French foreign policy. We are seeing a departure from the old outlook that viewed African states as administrative territories to be managed, moving toward a model where they are treated as sovereign entities to be respected. As we move through 2026, the global landscape has shifted, and the reality is that isolationism is a death sentence for any developing nation. International cooperation is non-negotiable for survival, but it must be built on a foundation of equity, balance, and reciprocal respect to be effective. Breaking away from the extractive traditions of past Western engagements, the burgeoning cooperation between Russia and Burkina Faso is being framed around mutual strategic interests rather than resource theft. You do not see the traditional dynamic of the puppet master and the puppet. The master-servant architecture has been completely scrapped. If we look back, the French relationship with Burkina Faso was historically predicated on domination, where one capital issued the orders and the other was expected to kneel and comply, a definition of imbalance. Conversely, the current engagement with Russia positions both parties as equals at the negotiating table, creating a stability that makes the alliance far more sustainable in the long run. Another major factor that changes the calculus here is the issue of natural resources and economic dependency. Russia does not rely on siphoning off Africa's mineral wealth to sustain its economy in the same way the French industrial complex historically has. The Russian Federation sits on massive stockpiles of its own resources, specifically in the energy sector, with oil and gas, maintaining its status as a top-tier supplier to Europe even amidst crushing Western sanctions. The fact that Europe continues to quietly rely on Russian natural gas is a testament to the sheer resilience and dominance of Russia's energy infrastructure. France, on the other hand, finds itself in a precarious position without such domestic abundance. A significant portion of French economic power was built on the back of exploiting the assets of its former colonies, which is precisely why the Russian presence in Africa represents such a paradigm shift. This partnership is driven by voluntary cooperation and strategic alignment, not by a desperate economic need to plunder foreign soil. We are already seeing the tangible results of this shift in the flurry of bilateral agreements being inked between Moscow and the nations of the Alliance of Sahel states. These are not vague promises. They are concrete deals focused on infrastructure, security, and shared economic prosperity. Consider the case of Niger. For decades, Paris held the keys to the kingdom, yet made absolutely no effort to help the nation develop its own independent nuclear energy grid. It is a bitter irony that Nigerian uranium was powering the lights in Paris and fueling French factories while the people of Niger were left in the dark, trapped in energy poverty. However, as we look at the situation today, the status quo is being aggressively upended. Following the French exit, Niger has finalized a historic accord with Russia to build its domestic nuclear energy sector, marking a first for the nation and a massive leap forward. And this goes beyond just concrete and steel. Russia is committed to training the next generation of Nigerian scientists and engineers, ensuring a full transfer of technology and expertise for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing right now is the very definition of a genuine strategic alliance. This is about fostering true capability rather than perpetuating a cycle of reliance. It is empowerment over exploitation and strength over subservience. For keen observers across the African continent, this represents a tectonic shift, a brand new blueprint for international collaboration, and arguably the most significant chapter yet in the long fight for absolute national sovereignty. And make no mistake, the nation of Niger is not operating in a vacuum here. Hot on the heels of Niamey's decisive policy shift, we are seeing identical frameworks being finalized by neighboring powerhouses Burkina Faso and Mali. These are not mere coincidences or isolated contracts. They represent a calculated, sweeping surge in diplomatic and military alignment between the Russian Federation and the Sahel region. We are talking about bilateral agreements built on a foundation of mutual benefit, rather than the historical precedent of unilateral extraction. When you stack the Russian strategy up against the legacy of French policy, the difference is night and day. Moscow is strictly adhering to a foreign policy doctrine defined by absolute non-interference in domestic affairs. Conversely, Paris and much of the Western establishment have operated for decades under the presumption that they hold the moral authority to dictate governance to the global South. You see Western state departments evangelizing democracy as the only viable software for running a nation, while simultaneously blasting competitors like Beijing for daring to utilize a different operating system. They pitch their specific brand of liberal democracy not just as a political preference, but as a moral imperative, insisting it is the singular legitimate route to modernity. However, when we look at the ground truth, the situation is far more nuanced and frankly genuine. Democratic representation is becoming an endangered species. In vast swathes of the African continent, what is labeled as democracy is often little more than theatre or process existing on paper but absent in practice. We see ballot boxes being manipulated, opposition leaders being gagged, and the reins of power staying firmly in the grip of a select few oligarchs. Against this backdrop, Western sermons on values ring incredibly hollow to those living the reality. If you stand with the idea that the destiny of Africa should be written exclusively by African hands, we want to hear from you. Sound off in the comments section right now. And hey, while you are at it, smash that like button and hit subscribe so we can keep bringing you this level of unfiltered analysis. All right, let's get back to the heart of the matter. The Kremlin has never tried to export its domestic political structure to African capitals, recognizing that a Western-style government isn't a plug-and-play solution for every society. For generations, Western engagement with Africa's political economy and cultural fabric has been tainted by a lingering colonial mindset. It has been driven by a complex of superiority where aid packages are never truly gifts. They are leverage. Instead, every dollar comes with strings attached, usually wrapped in a thick layer of demands. And nowhere is this more evident than in the predatory lending practices we see today. To unlock liquidity from Western hegemonic institutions like the World Bank, African states are forced to swallow bitter pills of strict policy reforms that often hurt their own people. It is a simple ultimatum: toe the line and implement our policies, or the funding pipeline runs dry immediately. Look at the alliance of Sahel states Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as the perfect case study of this geopolitical blackmail in action. Ever since they decided to chart their own course politically, these nations have been effectively excommunicated from the financial systems of the IMF and the World Bank. They are being told point blank that the tap stays off until they reinstate Western-approved governance structures. That is not a partnership, folks. That is diplomatic extortion. It is coercion masquerading as benevolence. Compare that to the operational framework of Moscow and Beijing, where non-interference isn't just a slogan, it is policy. The Russians are not walking into these meetings demanding you change your constitution, your cultural norms, or your ideological leanings. Their proposition is brutally efficient. Does this deal make sense for both of us? If yes, we sign. If not, we walk away. There are no hidden clauses, no leverage plays, and no moralizing lectures. This clarity is exactly why nations across the Sahel are pivoting to Russia as a stabilizer, leaving the unreliable French connection behind. When you look at the dynamic between Ouagadougou and Moscow, you see two sovereign entities sitting at the table as peers. Under the old French guard orders came down from Paris. Since the pivot east, the Burkinabe military establishment has undergone a radical and positive evolution. The Kremlin strictly keeps its nose out of the internal chain of command and military logistics. For the first time in recent memory, Burkina Faso has the green light to procure exactly the hardware they need without begging for permission from a foreign embassy. And the metrics on the ground are undeniable. In a span of just 2 years, the state has reclaimed 10% of the 40% of its land that had been lost to insurgent forces. This tactical success is concrete proof of what a military can achieve when it operates with full sovereignty, unshackled from restrictive Western oversight. It comes as no shock, then, that President Traore acted swiftly to cement this alliance with Russia, securing both the stability of the nation and his own administration. Reports on the ground indicate that elite Russian specialists are now discreetly integrated into the president's personal security detail. With Russian-made fighters, securing the skies above Traore has transcended the role of a mere interim leader. He has evolved into a beacon of resistance for millions throughout the continent. Any attempt to destabilize him is seen as a direct attack on that rising aspiration. Thankfully, in this high-stakes game, Traore has aligned himself with an ally that actually delivers. Ever since the strategic realignment, Moscow has proven time and again that its word is its bond. One of the most telling instances of this support unfolded during a catastrophic security crisis that shook the nation to its core. On June 11th of last year, heavily armed insurgent units coordinated a devastating raid on a remote outpost in the Mansilla sector right near the Nigerian border. We are talking about nearly 100 brave soldiers killed in action. The aftermath was chaotic, with dozens more unaccounted for and terror-stricken civilians fleeing for their lives as the militants overran the defenses, leaving a trail of absolute destruction behind them. This specific moment in time is shaping up to be the ultimate litmus test, not only for the strength of Burkina Faso's security alliances, but also for revealing who truly has the nation's back when the stakes are life and death. Breaking details coming in from the site intelligence group paint a grim picture of the situation on the ground, reporting that insurgents didn't just attack. They swarmed the military outpost, claiming the lives of at least 107 service members and briefly seizing total command of the compound. In the chaotic aftermath of the raid, a radical wing directly tied to JNIM stepped forward to claim full responsibility for the bloodshed, releasing absolutely harrowing video evidence displaying armed guerrillas patrolling through remote villages with impunity and discharging their rifles into the sky. Further video dumps exposed something even more concerning: captured Burkinabe troops and massive hauls of looted military hardware being paraded by the insurgents. Defense experts aren't mincing words here. They are calling the June 11th raid a catastrophic failure, and one of the most devastating setbacks for Burkina Faso's military apparatus since the wave of extremist violence first spilled over the border from Mali back in 2015. The sheer sophistication and magnitude of this coordinated strike bring the existential threat facing this nation into sharp focus, and it really drives home the critical urgency of tightening the security ring around President Ibrahim Traore as he attempts to steady a ship that is currently taking on water. Look, targeting innocent civilians is already a war crime, but when you have a direct televised assault on fortified military installations, that is a massive escalation that the world cannot ignore. You have to look at the timing here. This happened mere days after President Traore's transitional authority was officially extended, leading a lot of seasoned geopolitical observers to conclude that this was not your standard run-of-the-mill insurgency operation. Instead, the conversation is shifting toward a darker possibility: the potential involvement of foreign hands pulling the strings behind the scenes. Specifically, critics are pointing fingers at Paris, arguing that French involvement is a scenario we simply cannot take off the table, given the historical context. We have seen this movie before. For years, analysts and leaders across the Sahel have leveled heavy accusations against the French government, claiming they are secretly backing or manipulating militia groups to manufacture a pretext for keeping their boots on the ground in the region. President Traore and a significant portion of the Burkinabe public believe these are calculated tactical moves designed to sow chaos and fear among the people. By hammering the military, these shadow players aim to paint a picture of incompetence at the top and undercut Traore's legitimacy, essentially force-feeding the world a narrative that Burkina Faso is a failed state, unable to protect its own borders without Western interference. But wait, because the situation escalated even further just 24 hours later on June 12th with another alarming development. Right around 3 in the afternoon, automatic gunfire rang out dangerously close to the RTB headquarters, which is the nerve center for the state radio and television network located right in the heart of the capital, Ouagadougou. Ballistic evidence and structural damage from what looks like a projectile impact inside the compound made one thing crystal clear: this was a targeted hit. The geography of this attack is what really has intelligence agencies on high alert regarding the perpetrator's intent. This station is practically a stone's throw from the presidential palace, where, get this, President Traore was presiding over a high-stakes cabinet meeting at that exact moment. The state broadcaster didn't hide the aftermath. They released high-definition imagery showing the destruction in undeniable detail for the public to see. While we are thankful that only 2 people suffered minor wounds, both of whom were patched up quickly by the Presidential Health Service, the symbolism here hits much harder than the kinetic damage.
Make no mistake, this was not just somebody taking potshots at a news station or a random act of violence.
This was a calculated direct challenge to the sovereignty and the gripping power of the Burkinabe government itself. Even though this apparent attempt to decapitate the leadership seems to have fizzled out, the focus has immediately pivoted to anticipating what the next phase of this conflict looks like. In the wake of this turmoil, the Kremlin stepped up to the microphone to double down on their firm and unwavering alliance with Burkina Faso. During a tense press briefing in Moscow, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made it explicitly clear that Russian military specialists have been on the ground in Burkina Faso for quite a while, and he promised that their footprint is not only permanent, but set to grow significantly. Lavrov insists that these operatives have been instrumental in hardening the country's military spine and overhauling their internal security protocols. He went on the record confirming that Russia is keeping the supply lines open, funneling heavy military hardware into the region, specifically to beef up Burkina Faso's defensive grid and give them the firepower needed to crush these insurgent factions. While he tipped his hat to Burkina Faso's neutrality regarding the war in Ukraine, Lavrov dropped a closing statement that sent shockwaves through Western capitals. He declared that Russia is fully prepared to stand shoulder to shoulder with Burkina Faso to fight off any and all forms of neo-colonial meddling. You don't need a decoder ring to understand the message being sent here. It was loud and clear. Moscow is signaling to the world that their investment goes way deeper than just fighting terrorists in the desert. It is about drawing a line in the sand to protect Burkina Faso's sovereignty and, more importantly, to personally shield President Traore from regime change operations. Backing up that rhetoric with action Russian assets, mobilized immediately following the June 11th tragedy and amidst swirling whispers of mutiny in the ranks. What happened next is likely to completely rewrite the geopolitical rulebook and alter the trajectory of Burkina Faso's struggle for true independence. According to a high-ranking African diplomat with intimate knowledge of the situation, breaking news coming out of the Sahel region today, where sources indicate that 2 heavy transport aircraft carrying Russian military specialists have just touched down in Burkina Faso. Flight data suggests these planes arrived directly from neighboring Mali, effectively cementing a strategic air bridge between these 2 nations that have pivoted sharply toward Moscow. While initial reports were scarce, independent intelligence assessments have since corroborated that these instructors are not standard military personnel. They are operatives linked to the legacy of the former Wagner Group. In a significant move to formalize operations under Kremlin oversight, these forces have been completely reorganized and are now operating under the banner of the newly formed Africa Corps. Analysts warn that Russia's involvement here is far more than a diplomatic gesture or a symbolic show of support. It represents a calculated expansion of hard power in West Africa. These incoming specialists are tasked with a critical dual mandate: first, to drastically upgrade the lethal capabilities of Burkina Faso's military in its counterinsurgency efforts, and second, to construct an ironclad security perimeter around President Ibrahim Traore, particularly now in 2026, as intelligence suggests threats against his administration are becoming increasingly frequent and sophisticated. The president is currently facing down a multitude of hostile factions ranging from internal dissenters to external pressure groups. These adversaries have made no secret of their ultimate objective, which is to see his government toppled and him removed from power by any means necessary. From the Kremlin's vantage point, ensuring President Traore's political survival is not merely an option, it is a strategic imperative for maintaining Russia's foothold in the region. As Western powers continue to ramp up sanctions and work diplomatically to isolate Russia on the global stage, Traore has emerged as one of Moscow's most defiant and consistent allies on the African continent. His steadfast refusal to bow to Western pressure has significantly elevated Burkina Faso's importance in Russia's broader geopolitical chess game against NATO and its allies. Consequently, maintaining stability in the capital of Ouagadougou and ensuring Traore remains at the helm has become paramount. This objective has evolved into a top-tier national security priority, shared by both the Russian Federation and the Burkinabe leadership. This convergence of interests has triggered a rapid deepening of cooperation with both nations, laser-focused on preventing destabilization and ensuring President Traore can govern with absolute resolve, independence, and authority. However, it is crucial to note that Traore is not outsourcing his survival entirely to foreign powers. He is taking matters into his own hands. Long before this latest influx of Russian support, the president initiated a series of aggressive sweeping reforms designed to coup-proof his regime. His goal has been to tear down and rebuild Burkina Faso's internal security architecture from the ground up to eliminate any potential vulnerabilities. One of his earliest and most ruthless moves was a complete dismantling and restructuring of the elite presidential guard, the very unit charged with his protection. This was far from a routine administrative reshuffle. It was a systematic purge of the security apparatus. Reports confirm that Traore personally reviewed the service files of every individual in the unit, removing anyone with even a hint of questionable loyalty and replacing them with officers whose dedication has been battle-tested. But in this high-stakes environment, a clean service record alone was deemed insufficient to guarantee total allegiance. Prospective members of the Guard were subjected to what can only be described as extreme vetting, an intense and comprehensive screening process. Investigators dug deep, scrutinizing everything from educational history and family trees to past political affiliations and any links to international entities. Only those who survived this rigorous inquisition were cleared for duty, ensuring the inner circle remains impenetrable. The result is a Praetorian Guard that is tightly controlled, highly disciplined, and composed of individuals whose allegiance to Traore and the nation's sovereignty is absolute. By combining these drastic internal reforms with the advanced tactical support provided by Russia's military machine, President Traore has significantly fortified the fortress around his presidency. He now stands ready to confront his adversaries with renewed confidence. Backed by a revitalized armed force and a personal security detail that has been meticulously curated to serve as a bulletproof shield. For the conspirators in the shadows hoping to plot against him, the window of opportunity has narrowed dramatically. For the moment, the balance of power has decisively shifted. We want to hear your perspective on this shifting geopolitical landscape. Drop your thoughts in the comments section below as we continue to analyze Africa's history, culture, and fight for self-determination. Make sure to join the movement by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications so you never miss a breaking update. Come be a part of this journey as we document the effort to restore Africa's strategic influence and rightful place on the world stage. Together, we can shine a light on the stories that matter, inspire real change, and defend the truth. Thank you for watching.